That night, Furciel lay in bed, unable to sleep. He thought about the events of that day, how that fairy had appeared to him whilst he was working steadily through the endless and mundane routine of being a woodcutter, chopping log after log in his forest full of trees. He had never been particularly unhappy with his simple life, but now he'd been given the image of something greater, the prospect of a better way of living. He suddenly felt bored and frustrated with the way his life had turned out. Worse still, he was angry with himself because he'd wasted the one opportunity to make the world a better place, simply because he wasn't ready for the responsibilities that came with it when it appeared. It was then, as he lay there, muttering and tutting to himself and thinking about all the trees in the forest, the hundreds he'd cut and the thousands left still to fell, that he had the most brilliant idea of his life to date. Like all brilliant ideas, it was so ludicrously simple that only a child or an insane person could have thought of it. In fact, it was so brilliant, the king, shall I say once again, the future king, because we all know how this story turns out, instantly felt sleepy. And as he began to float away into that warm land of sleep that all brilliant ideas come from, that place that only children truly know and insane people deeply mourn, a smile spread across his face. The following 2 weeks, the king persevered with the life he'd always known, chopping down trees and then cutting them into logs. It was hard for him to do it now that he'd had his brilliant idea, but he did it nonetheless, and made an effort to always be happy and cheerful as he worked, sometimes whistling the overtures of symphonies or the theme tunes to popular TV programmes as he chopped away. Then finally, on the afternoon of the 14th day, as the sky dimmed into orange and red embers that burnt through the leaves overhead, the king heard a polite cough behind him, and turned round. "Hello," said the bad fairy, still disguised as a good fairy, but now wearing a completely different outfit, with some rather fabulous buttons, which made him look all the more like he knew what he was talking about. "Oh, hello," said the king, pretending not to be really all that bothered the moment he'd waited 2 weeks for had finally arrived. He didn't even seem to notice that the bad fairy had changed his clothing, or maybe he knew more about fairies' wardrobes than he was letting on. Neither the king nor the fairy said anything to each other then. To be honest, it was a little bit awkward. "Nice weather," the fairy offered. "Yes," the king agreed. "Yes, it's not so bad. It's been quite mild, hasn't it?" Said the bad fairy, who began to look intently at the hangnail on his fairy fingers. Both of them stared at the sky about them. The bad fairy started whistling the theme tune to Tonight's Landing. "Do you remember that half-wish you owe me?" the king asked. "Oh, yes," replied the bad fairy, relieved. "Have you thought about what it was you like?" "I have, yes." "Oh, good," the fairy replied. "I do so like granting people's wishes." "Well, that's fortunate, what with you being a fairy and everything." "Oh, I wasn't always a fairy, you know." "You weren't?" "Nah." The bad fairy scratched his chin and looked again at the hangnail on his finger. The king shifted nervously onto his other foot. "So, can I make my wish now, then?" "Eh? Oh, yes!" cried the bad fairy. "Sorry, just sort of zoned out there." "Now," he began, clearing his throat and making his voice even more impressive to add a sense of ceremony to the occasion. "What is your third and final half of a wish?" The king similarly cleared his throat, and then spoke in a clear, important-sounding voice. "I wish my second wish had never happened, but my first one did." A silence hung in the forest air. "Hang on," the bad fairy frowned. "I'm a bit confused now." "Yeah, me too," the king admitted. "So, if you wish your second wish didn't happen, but your first one did, does that mean you want me to owe you another wish?" "No, I don't think so," said the king, "because by your nature you exist outside of linear perception, and therefore any profound impact you make upon the existence of any mortal such as myself would be perceived as therefore still to be born from the original criteria on which you offered it to me." "Gosh, you know a lot about temporally conditional interstitial mechanics," said the bad fairy. "Well, I am king. Or at least I was, or will be, or will be again. I think I'm confused again. Do I get an extra wish because I've taken one back?" "No," said the fairy simply. "It's against the rules." "Oh. Well, then what if I wish for 3 more wishes?" "Try that old chestnut on me," the fairy glared, pointing his rudely shaped wand at him, "and see what happens." What does happen? Just try it and see." But what happens? "Try it." "Well, I'm not going to waste my last wish just to see what would happen." "Very wise," said the fairy, lowering his wand and muttering something to himself about smart-assed, spoilt little rich brats who are breastfed on conundrums of contractual law. "So what is your wish?" the bad fairy continued, trying to deflate the tense situation. "I want to be king again," Furciel said. "Gordon Bennett! What? Again? What makes you think you'll like it this time? You were already king once and you didn't like it. You used up 2 wishes that left you exactly where you started, and I had to put everything back as it was. That's not easy, you know. It may look like I just wave a magic wand, but there's a lot that goes on behind the scenes, let alone the paperwork afterwards." But Furciel wasn't listening. He was staring at the fairy's rudely shaped magic wand, having only noticed it properly for the first time. Quickly the fairy hid it behind his back. Well, are you sure you want to be king again? All of the people will hate you. Some will even think you're evil, and trust me, that one hurts. But no one will ever fight each other again, Furciel offered. Yes, the fairy replied wearily. But you will be the loneliest man in the world. I know. But I was lying awake a few weeks ago, after I last saw you, and I had this thought. I was thinking about trees. And then it all made sense. The fairy blinked once, smiled politely, and began to back cautiously away. Hear me out, said the king. I thought about all the trees in the forest. Hundreds of thousands of trees. I'm a woodcutter, so it's my job to cut trees down. The fairy made a sarcastic remark about thinking woodcutters milked cows, but the king went on regardless. I've cut down so many trees in my life, I can't remember how many. It occurred to me that if I don't make this wish, I will have to go on, cutting down tree after tree without end. The fairy began to explain the nitrogen cycle to the king, but the king interrupted him, continuing to explain. But if I become king, I won't need to cut down all the trees in the forest to do my job. I will just need to cut down one. From that one tree will come the need to keep the others standing. I will have done my job, and yet kept the other trees intact, all with the least damage or upset to the forest as a whole. That's it? The fairy asked. That's your reason? It is, Furciel replied earnestly. That's my reason for being king again. The fairy paused, considering the man's words carefully. He followed the allusion tentatively in his mind, watching the king as he stood there in earnest, ready to take all the world's ills upon his shoulders. One tree to be cut down so that no other tree needs to be again. And the fairy smiled. He nodded slowly, and having reflected on his motivations and accepted them, told the waiting man this. That is quite possibly the biggest load of rabbit droppings I have ever heard. That makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. Your logic is utter custard. It is. Yes. The fairy paused, and his smile broadened. I love it, he exclaimed, leaping up and down on the spot in a strange sort of fairy jig, and waving his wand about in the air. Too fast this time for the king to notice what it looked like. It's brilliant. You're completely unhinged. I am. The fairy nodded. Totally bats. I have decided to grant your wish. You have? Yes. And I don't have to sign anything? No, the fairy mused, as long as you are aware of what your desire entails. I am, the king said decisively. I want there to be peace once more. Very well. And with that, he became king once again.